So let's get into it. LYLE McDONALD, the legend, back again. This is actually like we had a similar question last time on the podcast, but I know you're the only person that will ever get an honest answer in this fitness scene, because right now volume is the craze. More volume, higher volume, better volume. We have to find the maximum volume that we can ever recover from. And when I was first confronted with that topic, it was actually on the podcast with the person himself, and he was like, "Well, yeah, you gotta raise it until you don't progress anymore, and then you're at it." And I was like, "What the fuck?" So.
Yeah, I've got an old favorite cartoon whenever people bring this up, and it's Calvin and Hobbes. And I don't know if that was big overseas. And Calvin, who's a little kid, asks his dad, "How do they determine the weight limit on bridges?" And the father says, "Well, they just drive heavier and heavier and heavier trucks over it till it collapses, and then that's the weight, and that's what the weight limit is." And the mother says, "If you don't know the answer, don't tell them." And that's kind of what I liken this to. It's the let's keep raising volume until they break, and then we cut it back by 10%. And I actually know there's a very famous powerlifting team. Apparently, the way they train new lifters, they bring them in, they put them on their drug regimen, they raise the volume until they get sick, basically until they start to get overtrained, and then they cut it back by 10%, and that's what they do, which you might as well, I would refer to that as maximal recoverable dosage rather than max recoverable volume. So I think that's, that's my fundamental problem with it, is this idea that doing the most volume or even approaching what might break the person is going to be the best way. Now, okay, fine. If you have, someone comes to me and says, "I have 6 weeks to make the most progress possible," I would certainly consider that. Of course, again, if you break them, I find broken athletes don't make much progress. So that's the danger with that, of course. But you might push the envelope. But people forget training is long term. Right, whether you're going to get to your limit, which is your genetic limit, kind of regardless of how you get there, right? Certainly you need enough volume to stimulate gains, right? We know there's probably a minimum threshold volume. At the other extreme is the maximal recoverable volume, which is fine, and maybe for a full-time athlete, maybe if you've got full-time recovery. Even then, that's not most people's lives, and I think recommending that to the average person to find the maximum they can tolerate. Long term, what if you get stressed for a month? Well, that same volume is going to suddenly break you. There's also the issue of not having a particularly good idea of what is defining recovery. Like I believe the same individual once said that you should that the right volume is the one that stops you making progress. Well,
yeah, that was it.
What? Like now fine, getting, coaches have often used, they call it whatever, shock microcycles, double shock microcycles, planned overreaching. Actually, it's funny, I read about that stuff for years and I never saw an actual example. And there's a book called, I think it's Practical Programming by Mark Ripito and Glenn Pendlay, and I forget the third author. And it's the first one I ever saw that actually had a concrete, this is how we do it, where it's like a week easy, 2 weeks where you just hammer the athlete, and then you spend 4 weeks kind of recovering and hopefully hitting a new peak. Great if you're dealing with a high-level elite athlete who's beyond the adaptation phase where standard loading is going to work.
And
but for everybody,
but training, like no life factors.
Yeah. Exactly. These are full-time Olympic level athletes that are going to do this kind of stuff. They're already at a training level. They know what they can handle. But I think you look at most athletes, maybe endurance guys are different because they're just all overtrained obsessives. And they'll do those, cyclists will peg a 600-mile week or whatever nutty crap they're doing. But, for strength power, there's just too much risk of injury, of overuse, of chronic tendonitis. I did this last year. I ramped my volume too fast, and I had knee tendonitis for 6 months, where it would take me 30 minutes to even be able to hit parallel in the squat. So it's like, I personally, and realize this is an age thing, I've always been a little conservative. As I've gotten older, I've gotten more conservative. I would rather see someone work at a moderate volume, right? Not too low, not too high, and focus on the long term. Because if I break them, if they get hurt, if they get niggling injuries, something bad happens for a week, that maybe 5% faster results they're getting, to me, is way more offset by the potential negatives. Because trust me, if you've been hurt and lost 9 months of training, you don't know just how much that sucks.
And a big factor for me is that you don't get a red light when you notice that you're overtrained. Because for me, it was like, I started a deload. I was never a person that wanted to deload. And then I did a deload, and then I was like, well, that's how recovered actually feels. I never noticed it before, that I was not recovered.
Right, and I wrote a series about that. I wrote this long series on overtraining and overreaching, and it's like 8 parts. And there's this definition. Okay, overreaching is when performance goes down, but you recover in 2 weeks. And overtraining, it takes longer than 2 weeks. But here's the problem: you only know that after the fact, right? None of this is useful information before it happens. It's only like, okay, I've wrecked myself. If I take 2 weeks to recover, then I was only well, that's fantastic. And if you don't, if you wait till you're cratered that hard, and I knew a guy that took a year to recover, well, and I think that's kind of the issue. If we had a better way of knowing when someone was hitting their limits before it was too late, like I said, it's the bridge example, which I know is me being, but it's true. You don't know until it's too much, till it's too late. Because suddenly you've stagnated for a month. Well, great. Now you can cut it back, but how big of a hole have you dug? So I think that's kind of, when we get better technology and maybe we could go with bar speed or, even heart rate variability, there's this huge lag time. I played around with heart rate variability during the late 2000s. It was when it was new. And the watch I had sucked and crapped out after 3 weeks, and the software was a nightmare. I had to run it through 2 different pieces of software. It only told me after the fact what I already knew. I was like, oh, I feel wrecked, and I'd throw the watch on and go, yep, heart rate variability screwed. Fantastic. It did, because I don't think it changes quickly enough to really be that beneficial. So I think we're looking at long-term adaptation over 6 to 8 weeks. By the time you've dug the hole, it's usually too late.
So I guess that also answers the question that was the top-rated question, actually. Should you increase sets when progressing over a certain time, or rather, because people sometimes don't get that increasing weight actually also increases volume, which should be obvious in the equation, but
it's not right. And I think there's different ways. I have always tended to be just add weight to the bar over time, and I mean every workout. I don't mean every week. It depends on training status and all that other stuff. I tend to just keep it simple, but I in my youth I came from a lower volume approach, and I think I still have a slight bias for that. On top of just being old and conservative. Adding volume is one way to, there is a limit to how much you can just keep adding weight, because that can injure people too. Make no mistake about it. I know Eric Helms and his strength and muscle pyramid, which is excellent. He has kind of a flow chart, and it's if you're making progress at your current volume, well, don't mess with it. Yes, maybe adding 2 more sets, you make 1% or whatever it is better gains, but maybe you overtrain or get injured. And I think the way he did it is if you are no longer if you're no longer progressing, but you feel like you're recovering well, you should add a little volume. If you're not progressing and you don't you're feeling a little beaten up, you should deload. From memory, it's been a while since I looked at it, but from memory, that was kind of his approach to it, which I think makes perfect sense, right? You can stagnate for different reasons. Training is no longer an overload, or your recoveries, and those might have different approaches. There has certainly been an idea over the years that as your training progresses, you need to keep adding volume. The Russians were huge on this. By the end of their training, by the time you were a master of sport or whatever, they were just doing all the volume. They were also full-time athletes during their drug-fueled heyday, and this really got forgotten. I've seen other coaches, Charlie Francis did this, and his guys were using very low doses. And from beginner, you start with low volumes. Certainly you do more volume in the intermediate phase. But as you reach a point where your training is higher quality, you may need to reduce volume slightly, because suddenly, the guy who was squatting 275, 130-ish kilos, 125 kilos thereabouts, who's now squatting 450, so 200-ish kilos. Every set he's doing is putting a much greater stress on not only his muscles, his nervous system, his connective tissue, which I think there's another one for you, another podcast for another day. Connective tissue, to me, is the forgotten aspect of training. talk about bone, we talk about muscle, we talk about the nervous system, we talk about hormones. Nobody talks about.
Actually, we should get you together with Alex Leaf on a podcast. I have him scheduled as well to get like nutrition on glycine and stuff and training and put that together and do that. Are you?
Yeah, because I really do think that people have forgotten this, right? Muscles recover very quickly. Bone tends to be fairly strong unless you've got some nutritional problems. Tendonitis, super common. Why? Because the tendons take forever to adapt. Ligaments, if they adapt at all, and that's where people are getting those injuries. And anyone who's had tendonitis, who's had a tendon injury, it could be months. Muscular injury, unless you tear something, and even then you're usually tearing the muscle away from the tendon more than the tendon away from the bone. Muscles recover very quickly, great blood flow, yada, yada, yada. If you don't give your ligaments and tendons a chance to adapt, you can cause yourself some real problems. So anyway, we got off topic. So yeah, so now the guy who's squatting 220 kilos, every workout is a much greater stress. Now, on the one hand, of course, he can't just keep adding weight, right? You can't, when you're squatting that much, you can't I'll just add 2.5 kilos a week. It doesn't work that way. It'd be lovely if it did, unless you train high-intensity training, of course, because those guys just never plateau. That's why they all squatted 450 kilos. That's a joke, by the way. And so on the one hand, he may not be able to keep adding weight, but they're usually at that point, they're training much more cyclically. They do a volume block that's submaximal to give potential to move into the quality or whatever it is. But so they may need to increase volume, but they're increasing submax volume because they just can't work at limits quite so enormously. So I think there's elements of both to it. There's also the thing that there's age. Right? Again, remember the Soviets, they started when they were 8. Of course you're not doing a lot of volume. They hit puberty at 15, they're starting to increase volume. They're drugging them and training three times a week, full-time athletes. They're only doing that to what? They retire at 24.
Okay.
Well, I'm 47. Many of us in this industry started training, or the people who are getting into it, they're starting their training at 24. It's great to say 5 years, 10 years later, you should be doing more and more volume. Guess what? They're now in their 30s. Now they're recovering. They're not a 22-year-old. Trust me, they're not a 22-year-old. And so I think there's a lot of different factors. Brad Schoenfeld, I think, just did a podcast, someone linked in my group, talking about the older lifter. And I think that is an issue that's not frequently it's funny how it's always sort of the younger guys who are like, oh, do all the volume. Yeah, I did it too.
But they like go like, okay, do all the volume, but I can't really regulate my sleep and I want to go drink on the weekend. And well, yeah, that's a good idea to combine.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just like, yeah, like when as I like to tell people, I got away with a lot on youth and stupidity. Well, I'm not young anymore. I still do dumb stuff in the gym because I'm a male, and males never get quite past that. But when you're young, you can do ludicrous stuff. And probably, and I didn't drink and I didn't parties, but yeah, I got away with all kinds of stupid stuff. I still wish I'd known then what I know now, but it is what it is. In your 30s, that stops being the case. Into your 40s, that certainly stops being the case. I remember Arthur Dreschler, who wrote the Encyclopedia of Weightlifting, talked about, when he was in his 20s, he could do 3 heavy workouts a week. When he was in 30s, twice a week. In his 40s, once every 10 days. Because a maximum Olympic lifting workout was just breaking him. So I think there's a lot of overlapping variables. They're like, if you can train full time and you can figure out where your limits are, then absolutely do all the volume you can till you break, and then hopefully you don't break too hard. Because you get a career-ending injury, then I don't care how much volume you were doing, you're not doing any ever again. So
okay, so let's look at the other side, because I know one of your earliest articles is about cutting volume, and for me, when I go about doing the RFL, I just leave everything as it is and do auto regulation with RAR, so I can cut volume as I need to and try to keep intensity. Would you go about cutting volume from the beginning, or would you also go if you have to?
Right. So it's interesting, actually. So people know I'm working on this women's book, and Eric Helms contributed a lot of information. He and I have a long-standing. It's not an argument because he and I don't argue. Make no mistake. I agree with him about 98% You know, I'll never agree with anybody completely, not even with myself on a day-to-day basis. But one of our longest standing disagreements is overtraining volume when you diet, right? He is of the belief, kind of what you said second, keep your volume high, right? It keeps your energy expenditure up. You know, his logic is if this training built the muscle, X volume, whatever, say 8 sets of 8, just keep it simple. That's what built the muscle, that's what keeps the muscle. And there's a certain logic to that. Mine has always been when you're dieting, especially if you're dieting rapid fat loss or on very low calories, we know that you can maintain with, you know, 1/3 your previous volume, 1/3 your previous frequency, as long as you maintain intensity. And so he and I are disagreeing. But here's the
research is that based upon that number.
Or they did a bunch of stuff early on, and it was probably more looking at tapering than anything else. Oh God, what was his name? I think Mujiko, who's done a bunch of tapering research. There were just some study, and they've even done it when they've looked at like detraining in some recent studies where they'll strength train someone for 12 weeks. They'll be like, all right, we had one group do nothing, and they fell back, and we had one group do whatever, 75, and then we had one group do 1 set. And low volume, high intensity will maintain performance and muscle mass for fairly extended periods, 6 to 8 weeks. There's also some interest in this, like, what do you do with an in-season football player? Sorry, American football. What do you do with an in-season, he can't be lifting full. He's playing football on Saturday, and he's just getting the crap beaten out of him. He's got hard practices during the week. He may have 2 short strength workouts. What's the least volume he can do? Because when they stopped lifting, they lose their fitness and they get hurt more. They try to maintain full volume. But that's the sports performance thing. That's where a lot of this research came from. It's not really looked at in dieting. So the disagreement between Eric and I comes down to context. He is typically working with people either in the gym or online training, right? And when I've trained people, I once had to prep, get this, I had a female powerlifter / bodybuilder. I was prepping her for a bodybuilding contest 2 weeks before a powerlifting meet. I had to get her into contest shape and then hopefully take her to meet. Now, with her, and again, the powerlifting required a certain volume, but she was coming in, she might have done morning cardio, she wasn't feeling good. I was adjusting the volume day to day based on what I saw. If she did 2 sets and she was cooked, she was done for the day. If she felt good, we would do all 4. So I was doing it very much like that auto-regulation. The difference was I was there. Okay, now I've been writing books for 20 years now. And while this will sound really obnoxious, it is true. I have learned that I have to predict what people are going to do wrong. I have to predict their stupidity. And I know that sounds really self-important and stuff, but it's just I've seen what happens if I don't address, and I always have to address the mistakes people will make before the information, because if people read something that is what they want to hear, they won't get to the warnings. So if I'm writing a book for someone, I can't give them what I would be doing face-to-face, right? I cannot give them the whatever system of a half science, half guesswork, half experience that I would be using like I did with that female athlete. Eric has that ability. So he's doing that face-to-face to face. If I'm writing a book, I don't know who you are. I don't know what kind of dumb crap you're going to do in the gym, although I can pretty much predict that it'll be whatever the worst choice is, right? In rapid fat loss, what's the single thing I tell people not to do? Too much cardio. What's the single biggest mistake every single person makes? Too much cardio. Because they don't listen. So if I don't tell them to do that proactively, they're going to do it. Now, you're in a case, right, and so your situation, if you can auto-regulate your own training, if you do have the experience and also the objectivity to do that, you can probably make that work. The honest truth is the average person can't. Because how many people you've drawn up workout, if I tell someone I want you to do 4 to 5 sets of 8 to 12, they're doing 5 sets of 12. Period. It doesn't matter what I tell them. It doesn't matter if I tell them stop if you're cooked. If it's on the workout card, especially dieters, because dieters are crazy, and if I give them any leeway, they will mess it up.
I mean, let's be real. I've never seen a person on the RFL that was like, okay, I've read the disclaimer that 5 times says it, don't do cardio. Well, I could get away with something.
And it's just like, it's very, like, again, it sounds really self-important of me or superior for me to say that, but it's just, this is what I've seen over 20 years, is that I've even seen it, I've written, do not do this. And I've gotten at least one email in every book. So you're saying I should do this, right? It makes me want to tear my hair out. So yes, if you have the ability, and it may be different early versus late in a diet. Like if you're starting the first couple weeks, recovery's still good. If you want to keep your volume up, it keeps energy expenditure up, yada, yada, yada. Fantastic. As long as you're willing, if you're having, and it could be acutely, it could be an individual workout. Man, I'm just done today. Maybe you didn't sleep well, maybe whatever it is, you had a hard work day. I'm cooked. I did my 3 heavy sets, I'm going home. Because I'd rather someone do 3 heavy sets and leave than do 8 junk sets and just cause themselves more fatigue. If you're feeling good, fine. As long as you're not lying to yourself, and let's face it, most athletes do. They lie to themselves, they lie to their coaches.
I've recently noticed like how big of a difference an actual like hard goal is when doing RFL. Because like I in the past 3 months I tried like, well, I'm going to start an RFL, and I never really continued through. And now I know I have a photo shooting, video, all that stuff it's set in stone. And I'm on day 8 or so of RFL. I did it through Christmas as well. I don't give a fuck right now. Like I don't know why. It's easy. So the question would be, because we have a lot of people that will start the RFL concept like in the next month, obviously. What are some tricks, either like psychological, for example, like the gummy bears before the workout, or physiological or psychological, if we can even make the distinction, to make it easier?
Do a different diet. Like it's a hard ass diet. Although it's funny, some people find it very easy. That there's a weird sort of data set that frequently people's hunger goes down on low calories, which seems very counterintuitive, but it's almost like we've known those people, and I see them online, and I don't know why, but eating makes them hungry, right? There was even a recent study that eating more frequently increased people's hunger, which goes very much against no, I'm not saying it's universal. Even some people, fasting completely is better for appetite control for them. At least, again, this is typically very overweight individuals. We're dealing with a different dynamic than a lean individual. Because again, researchers don't study normal weight people, because why would you, for weight loss, generally speaking? So, I would say, intermittent fasting actually can help a lot, just because when you're on very low calories, it lets you have several larger meals. So, skipping breakfast or moving some of your calories later in the day. I know people that have modified it, just as little as adding half piece of fruit to each meal. It just sort of makes them feel better. And like, again, I have to be careful when I give recommendations like that, because suddenly half an apple will become a plate of pasta. Certainly the little bit of carbs before workout can really go a long way towards maintaining performance. Probably the biggest thing for low-carb diets, to make people not feel like absolute crap, you got to get sufficient minerals. That sodium, potassium, magnesium that get excreted on low-carb diets, like that's really, that was shown even in the early research to really decrease the overall fatigue and brain fog and stuff like that. I think for some people, probably learn to use spices, learn to, I'm very simple. People are like, what should I eat on RFL? Meat and vegetables. But I'll do that. I'll eat turkey straight out of the package. I think for people to make low-carb meals that actually have good taste and stuff, I think they'd be surprised. If you have some lean chicken with some good spices and veggies with the right stuff, it will feel like a meal.
We actually have a guy that just did like 40 recipes for the RFL that are actually pretty good. But he knows his stuff.
Exactly.
The salt point was really interesting, because I've noticed this when I try to do an RFL with protein powder, and I noticed that something's off. And obviously, if you started with deli meat, there's a lot of potassium in there, salt. So yeah, sodium. Okay, so let's get into it. Dieting as a learning experience, and I came to the topic because I listened to you on another podcast where you mentioned it, and dieting as a learning experience is a huge thing for me, because I could be classified as a continuous dieter up until half a year ago. So let's say I didn't have everything figured out, but it got progressively better.
Yeah, so this was something I think I mentioned on a podcast, kind of, as one of my many endless tangents, which I always make lots of on those types of things. And it's just something I've been kind of thinking about, especially, I've changed many of my ideas about like flexible dieting, and I think that was part of what really stimulated the thought process. So before we get into it, want to sort of set some ground rules on what I'm going to be discussing, right? So we've had for decades, what's the best diet? Low carb, high carb, low fat, yada, yada, blah, blah, whatever it is. Endless 40 years of studies to figure out what the best diet is. And the big conclusion in 2017 is the one people will stick to, which I was saying a damn decade ago, right? Over the short term, you will occasionally see differences. Low carb, you'll lose a few more pounds. High, whatever it is, whichever Mediterranean diet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in the long term, the difference is about a kilo, maybe 2 pounds. It's just not significant. And, you look at like the National Weight Control Registry. This is a U.S. thing that tracks over 3,000 successful dieters and the commonalities. And yeah, most of them use low-fat diets, but there's an increasing number that have used low-carb diets, and clearly they are successful for some. And to me, this argument over the best diet has muddied the waters because it's not the important question. We know how to get people to lose weight or fat. I'm going to use them synonymously because it's just easier, but I mean fat loss, obviously. Everybody argues about it, and for any diet you can name, whether it's intelligently set up or stupid as hell, somebody has succeeded on it, right? Even if you want to look at the whole bodybuilder thing, right? Neurotic physique athletes argue about this. Okay, in the 70s, people got into shape eating fairly normally and doing tuna and water at the end. In the 80s, people got into shape on high carb and ridiculously low fat. In the 90s, people kind of got into shape on low carb diets. Well, what's the commonality? The diet, the fact that they were on a calorically restricted diet for long enough to get lean. There was no superior. Now, fine, we can argue about muscle loss and all that stuff. Well, here's the single most important factor to prevent muscle loss: eat enough protein and resistance train. That's it. That is honestly, and I will say in the context of the best diet, we know that there are certain factors that should. Higher protein always beats lower protein. Okay, not always. Every once in a while there will be an outlier study, but in the aggregate, a higher protein intake is superior to lower protein intake. This is not even debatable in my mind. Anybody that writes a low protein diet, it's bad. Throw it out. It's shit. I don't care what else it is. It's wrong because it goes against all of the data. This is true for obese. This is true for lean. Eric Helms wrote that excellent review on lean physique dieters. It's been taken as a matter of faith that people dieting to the lowest body fats will lose muscle. Well, I present data in the women's book, and women are different than men in this regards. They tend to lose less muscle than men. From case studies to a cohort of women, they all reach contest shape with literally zero lean body mass loss. And the two combined factors, most of them, their protein intake was between 3 and 3.5 grams per kilo, so about 1.4 grams per pound. And I just want to comment that if you go back and look at my protein book that I wrote at least in 2008, and the stuff on my site, those are the numbers I give. And they combined it with heavy resistance training.
If you had to suggest a number of lean body mass loss that is not related to organ tissue in males, is there, because there seems to be, there are people, actually very good coaches that say, okay, you have to lose a certain amount if you diet down. But other than organ mass, is there really a significant amount that you have to lose as a male?
In men, it's a little bit different. I think you will find most men getting to sub 10% because, again, well, women there's a couple different factors. One is that they do use less protein for fuel during aerobic exercise. This is related to estrogen. Actually, if you inject men with estrogen, they have the same effect. Which very randomly, and I'm not a steroid guy, but it is of interest to me, it's turning out that estrogen has a lot of positive effects on hunger control, muscular remodeling, fat things like that. I suspect a lot of the effects of steroids during dieting is via the conversion to estrogen. I actually just read a paper.
Chester on about his stance on aromatase inhibitors.
He and I have talked about that actually in email. He and I email quite a bit, and he's the guy. You want a guy who wants to talk about steroids, you get him or Broderick Chavez. But yeah, they found out in the 80s anti-estrogens hurt the muscle gain. But I think during dieting, some of the benefits of steroids on preventing muscle loss on things are as much the testosterone as the conversion to estrogen. But men, so a woman, if you look at a man's muscle loss at say 15% body fat, it's essentially the equivalent of a woman's, or vice versa, depending on how you want to look at it. I think we know that the more fat you're carrying, the less muscle you lose. And I think part of the reason is that if you looked at men between 20% body fat and 10, you would see the same effect. But once they get below 10%, it goes wrong. The question then becomes, where's the lean body mass coming from? There can be a small loss of organ mass. Recent study, actually, the first week, a small loss of organ mass explained the adaptive thermogenesis that occurred in the first week, which is a little weird, but that's why I'm working on my liver hypertrophy protocol, because if we can grow the liver, we can burn a ton of calories a day. And and I've talked about this with Eric. I think a big part of it is probably glycogen and water, which of course will show up as lean body mass, intramuscular triglyceride. There may be some real muscle loss. It's hard for me to tell. I remember Dan Duchesne once saying, you will lose up to 1 pound of muscle for every 3 pounds of fat. Well, that comes from data from Gilbert Forbes back in the 80s. He was looking at overweight and lean individuals who were not on high protein intakes and who were not resistance training. And there's a really cool paper recently in Athletes. The title is something to the effect of, does fat loss in athletes follow the predicted theoretical Gilbert Forbes? I don't know. The title's something. Basically what they looked at was athletes who were involved in heavy training, eating a lot of protein, and losing fat relative or gaining weight or losing weight relatively slowly. And they found that their numbers had nothing to do with the theoretical curves, because they were combining heavy training or heavy training and insufficient protein intake, along with relatively slow rates. But they even gained a little bit of lean body mass while losing fat. They gained very little fat while they were gaining very slowly or losing over the course of so I think a lot of those old ideas. It's also interesting that back in the Duchesne days, protein intakes were gram a pound. And I'm sorry, but Eric's review says that it needs to be higher than that. It needs to be 1.2 up to 1.5, so 2.5 to 3.
Yeah, Eric's review in the European numbers was 2.7 per whole body and 3.1 per FFM. So
right, and that's what I do. I normalize my numbers. People who look at my numbers, they are higher than what you'll see in the literature or in the research, because I do normalize it for lean body mass, because I think it makes it more globally applicable, right? Because if you were to apply 2.7 per pound total body weight to someone who weighs 280 pounds, it's very different than someone who's 180. So I normalize it for lean body mass, and that skews it, that raises it by 10 to 15%, depending on what the population was. So in lean athletes, that 1 gram per pound equals 2.2 grams per kilo. You have bumped that by 10%, 1.1, 2.4, but that's still lower than his numbers. And the steroid, but again, I think a lot of the time, water, muscle glycogen, etc., especially because right after the diet, and Eric Trexler recently did a good study on this, he followed physique athletes from contest to week 1. Then they measured them, remeasured right for the contest 1 week later, and then 4 to 6 weeks later. And what they found, right, and this goes to that whole anabolic rebound everybody loves to talk about. Oh man, right after contest, you just get jacked.
They are primed for muscle gain. That's
but what he found was in the first week, lean body mass went up significantly, and it was all water and glycogen. Body water went up and all that stuff. And between weeks 4 and 6, the weight gain was 100% body fat, because that is what you are after. Any anabolic rebound you're getting is regaining what you lost during peak week. You're refilling intramuscular triglycerides, glycogen, and water, maybe building a little bit of, but you can't gain that much muscle in a week. So you just fill out like hell, and then you get fat.
I love the marketing speak, they're primed for massing.
I read a book one time, and this guy, it was just terrible. It was Secrets of Mass Gains, and one of his strategy was how to put on 7 pounds of lean body mass in 2 days, and he just carb loaded people.
Or he was eating avocados.
Yeah, exactly. So anyways, I think that some of the muscle loss stuff is maybe a little bit, and I'll be honest, you go look at my early articles, I was kind of repeating that information, but with sufficient protein and heavy resistance training, like I said, men, by the time they get to low body fats and testosterone is literally at castrate levels, you're not in the most anabolic state. But I think if you diet somewhat different, if you get away from the old traditional, especially the super fast diets, you've still got naturals who think, oh, I can do it in 12 weeks. Now try 6 months. This old 12-week contest prep that came out of the 70s and 80s was based around steroids, Clen, T3, growth hormone when it came in. In 12 weeks, you can do it. In 12 weeks, a drug-driven bodybuilder can diet from 12% to 5%.
Oh, I've known somebody that lost around 20 kilograms on DNP, HGH, and T3.
Well, yeah, exactly. Like, if you've got enough drugs, you can
gain strength.
Yeah, and you can YOLO diet, but for the natural, if they do that, they run into problems later in their prep. They're so far behind that they have to go and do really aggressively dumb things, and they do, because they don't start early enough. For women, that's even more problematic because they will cause themselves menstrual cycle dysfunction. But for men, I think that's a big part of it. It's just dieting poorly. There's also, I think, a big reason, or possibly the biggest reason, bodybuilders lose muscle, naturals, if it's actual muscle, is because they do change their training. High reps for cuts, no, high reps for muscle loss. Because, like I said, if X builds muscle, whether it's whether you maintain volume or not, if intensity is predominantly what builds muscle, that's what maintains muscle. And again, when you've got drugs, you can do high reps to burn more calories and deplete glycogen and all that nifty stuff. But when you are natural, that doesn't work, and the muscle will go away. Which doesn't mean you can't do both, right? I've often recommended depletion work to deplete muscle glycogen and increase fat oxidation and all that stuff. But if you don't have at least some heavy training during your contest diet or during any diet, unless you're a beginner, you will lose muscle mass because you removed the stimulus. Even if you were eating normally, if you did that with your training, you're probably going to lose some muscle. So I think that's the other big part of it, was just trying to mimic what the drug guys were doing. I mean, you've got steroids to protect your muscle mass. Hell, steroids, you can be essentially laid up with an injury, and steroids will keep you from losing muscle, and you're basically bedridden at that point. So, yeah. So I think there's a lot of different things that are contributing to the apparent muscle mass loss, some of which may be very real and some of which isn't.
To wrap this up, the last question, completely unrelated, adrenal fatigue.
Okay, so adrenal fatigue. That was the thing that was super popular, I want to say about a decade ago. The idea was that the adrenal glands release cortisol, DHEA, DHEAS, aldosterone, a bunch of, adrenaline, hence the name, or epinephrine in European, in non-America. They were seeing or claiming to see with certain people that they would get reduced morning cortisol, low cortisol during the day. People were lethargic, fatigued. It frequently seemed to, like in the physique community, it was due to people just doing too much exhaustive training for too long. And so they're like, oh, your adrenals are fatigued. Well, number one, muscles get fatigued. Glands do not really fatigue in that sense. I got a very semantic argument with someone a year or two ago about this. I'm like, your pancreas does not get fatigued from you being diabetic. It doesn't get tired, it gets damaged by the ceramide building up in it due to chronically elevated insulin. So the original concept, or you'd also hear adrenal depletion, and the idea was that because the gland was releasing over and over and over again, that it ran out. Like you ran out of the precursors for cortisol.
That's it for life.
Yeah, like you would run out, and again, not how the body works, right? You don't run out of these compounds. And I would honestly say, and it was funny, if you read some of the descriptions of the symptoms of adrenal fatigue, they were set up so that if you didn't have it now, you would have it eventually. They were so general as to be irrelevant. It was just like, do you get fatigued? Do you have trouble sleeping? Are you tired at work? Like, what human doesn't this?
Do you feel like you could achieve better in life?
And they sold a lot of supplements, and in over a decade, I never heard of a single person being cured, ever. And that's because in its defined sense, adrenal fatigue does not exist. There's actually a paper that literally that's the title of it. Adrenal fatigue does not exist. And part of the problem, okay, so there's two different things going on. And there's a really good book I've got called The Role of Stress and the HPA Axis in Chronic Disease Management. It's got, I can't see the guy's name. Oh, Guillen, Guillane. It's actually one of the, it's a really fantastic book on stress. It's a little technical, and he talks about this. And he talks about why the whole adrenal depletion model is incorrect, because we've got different lobes, the different parts of the adrenal gland release different hormones, and the precursor that was supposedly being depleted actually was never getting over to like cortisol, like it didn't work that way, which is probably, again, why nobody ever got cured, because you can't cure a fake disease, and fundamentally. However, there is something called adaptive hypocortisolism, and in this case, it is a situation where cortisol is lower than normal. It's lower in the morning and lower at times during the day. They have seen this in things like post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic fatigue syndrome, I believe fibromyalgia, don't swear me to that one, but in a couple of actual disease states. And what you actually see is a situation where people are super fatigued in the morning because cortisol is part of waking up, but then they're sleepless at night because due to the low cortisol response, they get an enhanced adrenaline response. So they're exhausted but wired. And this does seem to be, and there's another thing, there's a literature on what's called burnout. And it's something that they're seeing in like shift workers, nurses, people that just work chronically and exhaustively. And this seemed to cause...
It seems really common if you're deep into a diet like that.
And that's where I talked about it, is it's the effects of chronic stress. So here's what's kind of happening. It's also very similar to overtraining syndrome. If you look at kind of the general, and a paper just came out that talked about this, and it looked at overtrained athletes and non-overtrained athletes. And what it found was that in response to exercise, the normal athletes had a normal hormonal response. The overtrained athletes couldn't raise their heart rate as much, but more importantly, couldn't raise cortisol as much. So something is preventing cortisol dynamics from being normal, but it's not the depletion model. Here's what happens. We overdrive cortisol for too long. That can be a combination of strict dieting, too much exercise, and those usually go hand in hand. There's also a psychological profile that is already associated with elevated cortisol levels. And I refer to these people online as being tightly wound. It's my polite way for saying completely effing nuts. They're the people online, you can see them, you can hear them, all caps. Why am I not losing weight? Like, you're just like, whoa, you just got to back off me here. Like, you can, exclamation point, exclamation, you can hear the stress in their voice. And the research, because research has shown that that group of women can actually cause their menstrual cycle to go away in absence of exercise or diet. They tend to be just generally stress responsive. They don't respond to quote unquote daily hassles, which I find hilarious that they use hassles in a technical term. And but they tend to be perfectionists who are very reliant on external validation. And my God, if that doesn't, if that 90% of physique athletes, I don't know what does. And so they're starting pre-stressed. And this group that has done this is dieting a psychogenic stress, right? Like you said, we want it to be faster. We're stressed about the dieting process, both biologically and psychologically. Athletes have to worry about competition, maintaining their training. Female athletes have the additional issue of being judged on their appearance, even as performance athletes. This is extremely common. So there's all this stuff going on, and it can combine. So what happens is you overdrive cortisol. And I've talked about this repeatedly. You get water retention, masks the fat loss. Rather than chilling out, people drive themselves even harder, add more cardio, cut more calories. And what seems to be happening is when you overdrive cortisol all the time, eventually the body just goes, whoa, and shuts down production. It is the body trying to protect itself. And that is hence adaptive. It is an adaptive process. Hypo, which means low cortisolism. And what's happening, it's not adrenal fatigue, it's not adrenal depletion. What's happening is there's changes in receptors. So, all right, so we've got the hypothalamus, right? We've got the pituitary gland. We got the adrenal gland. Hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland to send the cortisol, whatever it is, ACTH, goes CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone, ACTH, corticotrophic hormone. I don't know, whatever. Hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland to tell the adrenal gland what to do. Adrenal gland releases cortisol. Now, what should happen when cortisol goes up, it should tell the hypothalamus to stop telling the pituitary gland to release cortisol. Should be feedback in. That gets turned off. Maybe it gets turned up. So now even small amounts of cortisol drastically drop production. The pituitary gland becomes insensitive to the releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and the adrenal gland becomes insensitive to the. So basically, it's very similar to what happens in steroid users, right? The signal, the hypothalamus is trying to tell the pituitary gland to tell the gonads to release testosterone, but the whole system is just so whacked out that it's not like you can have a defect at the testicles where all the signal in the world just doesn't make them work. That's where HCG and clomid stuff come in. So the same thing is happening, where now the body, to prevent damage from excess cortisol, starts decreases its ability to release it at all. And this is not good because you're exhausted during the day and wired at night. And from what I've seen, usually the standard cure is they give you cortisone or prednisone. They give you oral cortisol in an attempt to raise levels to normal, which causes its own set of issues. DHEA supplementation has been shown in 1 or 2 studies to have a small benefit, but pretty much once it happens, I've seen nothing to suggest that it ever reverses. And this could be a couple-year thing. The Guillaume book, he says maybe 2 or 3 years of reduced stress overall. And don't get me wrong, a lot of the recommendations that the adrenal fatigue people made were not bad. They were cut out refined foods, don't abuse caffeine, which can raise cortisol, cut back training to lighter levels. The problem is that the people this is probably most likely to occur in are the last people that are going to do any of that. They do not want to reduce their training. You see athletes pushing themselves to complete exhaustion, no matter how fatigued. I know one very successful fitness professional, again, who I will not name, and I know for a fact that they grind themselves to 4 hours. They just chronic fatigue, joint pain problem. They grind themselves to 4 hours a day of training. In the face of all this, and this is what psychos do. Psycho athletes do it too, and that's how they get overtrained, is performance starts to go down. So what do? They train harder when what they need is rest, right? And that's that, and this kind of brings us full circle. The danger with things like do as much training as you can handle is when training starts to crater, most people are not going to pull back. They're going to do more and break themselves even harder. It's part of why my thing, I would rather see someone reduce their training volume from the beginning to make sure there's no risk, because you might be able to do it. You might be able to auto-regulate and be objective. You might not. You might think you can, but I've known a lot of people that I thought I could too. And, I realized years ago that I do tend to overtrain. I train too much. I train too much for too long. And having realized that, I would set up training cycles to protect myself from my own stupidity, right? I don't claim to be, I would love to tell you I'm above all mistakes, but I'd be lying. And I'm like, okay, look, I observed that at about the 12 to 14 week mark, I would blow up. And after I did this, for not more than 10 or 12 years, I learned eventually. Okay, here's the thing. Since you clearly can't keep your training in your pants, you won't keep the intensity down. And speed skating's weird. You have to train at a relatively higher intensity for boring reasons. I'm like, okay, fine. Your training cycle is 12 weeks, and then you take 2 weeks off. I just had to program it into the plan, because left to my own devices, I would fuck up. And I would lose weeks of training when I would dig myself that hole too deep. So it's the same thing here in the diet context. Yeah, if you have the control, the willpower to 12 weeks into your diet realize I'm getting gassed and cut things back, then absolutely that'll work. But if you've learned the hard way that you can't, I would suggest reducing your volume from the get-go.
Yeah, that's why we're so hard on that point to say people.
Sure.
We know that you think you're different, but like I've done the ERFL with like so many hours of incline walking that I actually managed to get a compartment syndrome and had to literally had my legs cut open. So we know that shit can go wrong.
Sure, and when it goes wrong, you end up, it's fun to push the envelope and get there faster, and then when you break the amount, I learned a very valuable lesson.
Like,
well, yeah, that's just it. Nobody ever expects to get injured. You want to find an injury expert, find someone that lost 9 months of training to get hurt. And years ago, so I was deadlifting, and I was doing very low volume. I was doing 2 heavy sets of 5, and I knew my form was breaking. But by God, my workout cards, 2 sets of 5, and I was going to be damned if I wasn't getting all 5 sets or all 5 reps. And if I'd been watching someone, if I'd been training someone, I would have stopped them at rep 3, I guarantee you. But nope, I'm different. I'm better. I'm going to get that 5th rep. And I heard the pop. I felt it echo up my spine, and I was lucky. I only strained a ligament. I could have blown a disc. I could have ended my career right there. Should be great because I don't really enjoy training anymore. But neither here nor there. And I lost 9 months. For 1 rep, I lost 9 months of training. I had to spend 2 months doing basically nothing. 2 or 3 months doing super slow on machines, and then it took me the remainder of the time to get back to where I'd left off. So for that 1 rep, I lost way more time. The progress I would have made from that rep had I not hurt myself, far less. So yeah, but again, when you're young, when you're stupid, if you're lucky to have that happen, you don't end your career. If you're unlucky, well, you have just given yourself a chronic injury.
Yeah, I'm actually also lucky that I'm still missing a part of the Tibialis interview, but other than that, I'm fine. I don't make any money with having beautiful legs, so that's the thing.
That's compartment syndrome is pretty awful. But dieting is, and I get it. The problem that physique competitors have, or even performance athletes to a lesser degree, when you have a specific date that you have to be in shape by, you have less leeway, right? It's fantastic to go, oh, you're feeling worked over, you should take a week off. You may not have that time to take. Now, the counter to that, and it's funny, right? I wrote this book, and Eric Helms was giving me expert feedback the whole time through, because what I came to through the research, he had basically kind of done experientially, and it's always nice when my theoretical nonsense actually matches reality. I'm always kind of pleased when that occurs, and and his big thing is like, because he's done presentations on this, and we worked it out, is you have to start early enough. You have to estimate your dieting time, which is always longer than you want it to be. And especially if you're a woman trying to go from 22 to 10%, you may be looking at 6 to 7 months of dieting. People want it done in half that time. And when you do it in half that time, you cannot lose a day. No matter how bad you feel, you cannot lose a day. So the way I set it up in the book and the way he does it is you estimate your active dieting time, but then you have to factor in the diet breaks and add those to the total. And those may add 2 to 3 weeks, because there's usually, you're going to take one every, 24-week diet and take one at either week 8, or week 10, week 8, week 6, whatever it works out to. But you have to plan those in. You have to plan in the maintenance days, which help to offset hormonal and all that other stuff. Again, for short-term diet, it's a different thing. 2 to 4 week aggressive diet, just go. By the time you're really worked over, you should be stopping. Most people don't. Most people want to stretch that. There's another one. People want to stretch that out just a couple more weeks, and then they just blow up. So when you're on a time frame, it is a little bit different, but that just points to the need to diet differently, and you have to start early, and probably start earlier than you think. My rule of thumb right now is whatever you think your dieting time is going to be, multiply it, add at least 50%, and possibly multiply it by 2. If you think you're going to get done in 10 weeks, expect 20.
Yeah.
Which sucks. That's goes.
I guess that's a good wrap up for everything.
I think we got to circle, to the whole thing about why by trying to, like I said, for short-term, full-time athlete, absolutely, you can push the envelope. Even then, I think you'll find a lot of coaches, and depending on the sport, Charlie Francis always said it's better to undertrain than overtrain, and this is what people forget, right? So let's say this is your break point, right? Your break point is 100%, and maybe if you worked right at that, or 99, you would make the fastest results. Well, here's the thing.
But you won't get 5% of gains for the last 5% of volume you add. You will get like... That's my other...
we're looking at such an enormous point of diminishing returns. Is 3 days a week gets you most of what you're getting. 4 days a week adds 10%. 5 days a week adds 5%. Yeah, if you're a gold medal contender, I'm for it. I'm all for it. And if you're not, get a life. I'm sorry. There's more enjoyable things to do than be in the gym all day. I guarantee it. But Charlie Francis thing, realized he was working with high-level sprinters. It's very easy to get injured, lots of impact, but weight training is the same way. Yes, if you did 50% of what you could, you're not going to make any gains. But if you work at 80%, if you work at 80% of your limits, that will stimulate progress. You are above the minimal threshold. You're probably not going to get hurt, and you may make better long-term progress. My coach, speed skating coach, and of course he never implemented this because he didn't work with geared athletes. His theory, which I think is valid, said find the largest amount of volume you can survive naturally, and then add drugs without changing your training, which I actually think is probably the best way to do it, right? Look at how many guys you see them do this. They're just like, yep.
You take the netty volumes right now and plug them into drug athletes. It's great.
Yes, exactly. They'll grow like weeds because the steroids will just make them so amazing recovery. But what guys do is they go on, and I asked Broderick, I think I asked Chester, it's just like, what is a rough increase in volume you can tolerate? And it's very hard to say, but guys go on anabolics and double their training volume. And now they're doing 3 hours, 6 days a week, and they're not growing any better because they are overwhelming unless they're taking stupid doses. I don't know if you saw the recent, the guy I forget it.
Grams of Dallas McCover.
Yeah, his testosterone level was 55,000 nanograms per whatever, which is roughly 55 times the normal level. He was taking a gram or two per day of injectables. Just like, oh my God. But yes, if you're taking whatever the magic 600 milligrams, if you double your training volume and frequency, you're going to overwhelm that. So, bump it by 10 or 20%. But yeah, I would rather see somebody train at a sustainable level long term than, like I said, elite athlete, I might push it more. The Bulgarians are trotted out, and you know what? They broke 65 out of 66 athletes. The one guy who succeeded won, but what do you try? If you're just the average person, why? Seriously, find another.
Chances are that you're average.
Everyone, and that's the thing. Everybody thinks that they are the exception. But by definition, most of you are going to be average. I am too. Like, that's what average means. By the same token, I go, everybody thinks they're an exception, but that's not what the word exception means. But people don't want to hear that. And it's funny, I talk to the older guys at my gym because we're all a bunch of old farts, and they're like, yep. I try to tell the younger guys now, and I'm like, yeah, but here's the thing. Would you have listened to you? I wouldn't have. Yeah. I wasn't ready to listen until it's too late. So at best, you get to coach people who might listen. But
okay, I'm gonna be smooth as fuck now and say, okay, if people want to listen to you further, where can they find you?
Yeah, that's good. I like that. Yes, bodyrecomposition.com as always is my website, and I might even update it here before too long. It's only been like 2 months. My Facebook group is super, super active, which also Body Recomposition. Usually the best place to find me. And I always like to note the nature of kind of who I am. We have a tremendous number of experts in their own fields, right? Like I'm a generalist. I know what I know, but like we've got 3 great physiotherapists and possibly another. We've got some medical types. We have a Brenda Murdoch, the eating disorder expert, who I always farm those out to. We have a woman who's an OBGYN who's got PCOS, so she knows a tremendous amount about that. So like anything I can't address, with Chad Messias, who's doing high-level cancer research, is in my group, and he's happy to rant about ketogenic diets and cancer all day, every day. But like we have some true. We got people doing research. We got Eric Helms pops his head in every once in a while. So Brad Schoenfeld. So if you just like I said, I tend to sort of attract people who are legitimate experts in their own field, and trust me, I learn from them whenever there's questions that I only have a vague knowledge of. So that's probably the best place. Just because I got to pimp it out. The women's book, I am in the final draft. I promise this time.
I'll plug it in my group as well, German Facebook group, obviously.
I'm on. Let's see. I've just passed the 300-page mark of about 400 for the, now it's just minor edits, finding all the goofball sentences that don't make any sense. I always know it's bad when I read a sentence and I'm like, I don't even know what I was trying to say. Because frequently I don't. It was written so long ago, I frequently don't know what my sentence is supposed to be saying. But I genuinely hope it will be out. Well, I'd love to get it out by first week in January, and there's a possibility, but it will be out in January, I promise. If I hadn't gotten laid up with the flu and bronchitis, it probably would have been out before Christmas. So,
all right, yeah, I guess that's it.